Well, good morning. It's good to see each of you. If you weren't intending to be in the class on Revelation, you're in the class on Revelation. So glad to have each of you here. I've been looking forward to teaching this class. It is, all the studies of the Bible are my favorites, but this one is like my favorite. So it's a special favorite because it is an unusual book. It requires a little bit more experience and also dedication with studying God's Word, and you'll see that as we go through. But a lot like the parable of the two men that built their houses on the foundation, in Luke's account it says that the guy that built on stone had to dig deep, and that's what we're going to have to do in this class. So we're going to have to do some deep digging to find the stone so that we're going to build our house on. But if we do, there's a lot of very valuable application that I think can be life-changing. This has been a good study in my life and been very encouraging, and I hope that it will be for you as well. All right, so let's talk a little bit about just the class itself and the folders. So the folders that you have 4 plastic dividers in there. There's 2 reasons for that. One is if this folder is something that you end up keeping for a long time, eventually the paper will start tearing out. And so the dividers at the very front and at the very back are there to help protect the paper to make sure it doesn't tear out so easily and that you can keep it for longer. So so that means there's going to be 3 sections in your folder that's going to have material in it. The first one's obviously the questions. Before next time, I plan to get you some more pages to go in the second folder, which is a copy of actually my Bible. And it's the way that I study and the way that I take notes, where I end up just kind of colorizing, highlighting the passages as I go through, and then I write the verses that are important and relevant out to the side. And so that'll end up being kind of a hint for you as you're doing these questions. So these are some difficult questions. You may find those hints helpful. Also, if you get a good commentary, you may find that helpful as well. So, needless to say, this is going to be a more challenging class than some of the other ones that you've participated in. It's going to require more study outside of class. But if you do, you'll get a lot more out of it. So I would encourage you to spend some time making sure that you come prepared. I'm hoping to cover basically a lesson each class. So that should give you a rough idea to make sure that you're prepared for class. Today we're just going to go over the introduction. All right, the introduction is going to be material that I've mostly supplied for you. But I'm sure some of you have done your own thinking, you've had your own experiences and done your own research. So we're going to be asking these questions as we go through. And that's in part so I can hear what you've learned and what you've understood. But if you've ever had a difficult or a crucial conversation with someone, one of the first things you want to do is try to repeat back what you think the other person said. And that makes sure that everybody's on the same page and we're not talking past each other. So a lot of this morning is going to be probably you repeating back material that I've already provided you in the introduction. That's okay. So that's to be expected, and I hope you will feel comfortable doing that. Plus, like I said, I would like to hear the things that you've learned as well. All right, so that being said, let's go ahead and get right into the introduction, and let's talk about the writing style. I mean, that's the first thing that jumps out at you when you start looking at this book, is this is a book that is not like any other book in the New Testament. So let's talk about that first. Is this a book that should be interpreted literally? No. All right, I'm hearing no, seeing head shaking no. Why? How do you know that?
First one talks about how it was sent and signified.
All right, so very early in the book. So if you think about like an amusement park or someplace you walk into and they got the big sign as you walk in, welcome to whatever, Revelation sign as you walk through the front door says, this is signs, this is symbols, this has been signified. So you're told right off the bat that this is something that's supposed to be interpreted figuratively. You can't take it literally. The other thing is you think about how you listen to other people talk, and how do you decide when they're using figures of speech versus when they're saying something you should interpret literally. What you probably do, whether you think about it or realize it or not, is you're defaulting to interpreting what people are saying literally. You just take everything at face value until it doesn't make sense. And then you go, maybe I should have taken that figuratively. And you're doing that all the time, just kind of unconsciously when you're just listening to other people. Like when Jesus said, somebody said something about Herod seeking to kill you, and Jesus said, go tell that fox. Well, was Herod literally a fox? No. And did he say, by the way, I'm going to use a figure of speech? No. But he wasn't literal fox, so you understood, oh, he must mean it figuratively, because literal doesn't work. In a similar way, if you try to take the book of Revelation literally, it's going to be too fantastic, too outrageous to be able to understand literally. So that's going to push you into a figurative interpretation as well. All right, so verses 1 through 3, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which was given to him, and then he sent and signified it by his angel. And he also says that this is a record of the things that he saw and the things of prophecy. So these words about signified, signs, vision, prophecy, those are all big clues that it should be symbolic. And then also the fact that he's seeing things, hearing things. These are visions, and he's in the Spirit, and he's told to come up to heaven to see something there. So all of these are clues. Some of them more than just clues. Like I said, it's the sign as you walk in the front door telling you should be interpreted symbolically and figuratively, not literally. All right, so signified just a little bit, especially for those who've been in Greek class, may find this a little bit more interesting. So this word is a bit unique. It actually has built into the meaning, the semantic range, if you will, the idea of producing an impression or showing with signs. All the other references in Scripture refer to something that is a symbol. Like when Jesus said, if I'm lifted up from the earth. He didn't say, if I'm crucified. He used this figure to refer to him being crucified. It's the same Greek word there. And then when he was talking to Peter about him being martyred someday, he was going to give his life for Christ. He didn't say, someday you're going to give your life for me. He didn't say that literally. He said it figuratively by saying, when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish. All right, he was telling him, you're going to end up dying for me. And it's the same word there also for him indicating that. Agabus's foretelling of a great famine by the Spirit, same word is there. The only one that might be debatable or questionable is in Acts 25:27, when Festus is saying, well, I wanted to indicate somehow what the charges were against Paul. And he may be just kind of using this as an exaggeration or an emphasis, like, I wanted to give at least some kind of clue to what the charges were. So even there, it could be a reference to kind of a figure or a veiled reference as well. So those are the only places where this word is used. And again, the idea is that he's sending it by signs or signifying it figuratively some way. All right, let's talk about apocalyptic literature. What do you understand apocalyptic literature to be?
Literature that talks about the apocalypse.
All right, the apocalypse. So we associate the apocalypse, apocalyptic literature with the end of the world. I mean, that's what most people think about when they think about that word. All right, so let's just talk about that real quick. So where does that come from? In verse 1, where it says the revelation of Jesus Christ, it is the word apocalypsos. Apocalypsis. I'm sure Marshall will give me a much better pronunciation on that. But it is just the Greek word for reveal. Every time you see the word reveal in your New Testament, it's the word for apocalypse. It's using it probably in a verb form, apocalypsis, but it just means to uncover, to disclose, to reveal. All right, so that's what the word means. But because that word is used to introduce the book of Revelation, which everybody thinks is this dramatic, fantastic, cataclysmic kind of picture here, then they associate that word with the end of the world. But it actually, by itself, has nothing to do with the end of the world. It just means to reveal or to make known. So, a bit ironic kind of where that's come from. So, the other thing that's also kind of ironic is God is intending to reveal some truth, but he's shrouding it in symbols. He's veiling it. So he's simultaneously revealing and hiding it all at the same time. So this is not unusual. This is not unprecedented behavior that we see for God. Think about the parables in Matthew 13. Why did he speak to them in parables? He tells the apostles as they ask him, why do you do this? Because to you it's to make known, it's given to you to understand, but to the others, their heart's going to grow hard. So, truth delivered in a way such that those who were honest and sincere could search, could understand, but those who didn't really want to understand, it would actually make their heart harder, and they would not understand. So, this is something that we've seen from God before. We need to have this love of truth that's talked about in 2 Thessalonians 2, 9-12. Otherwise, it's very easy for us to end up being deceived by a lie and getting thrown off the track of truth. All right, so how do we understand this book? This is not... Go ahead, Joshua. Yeah, absolutely.
I was thinking that, yes. But then also, some of the things, or probably most of the things, John himself didn't understand because of prophecy, and so he was just writing things down. And so, obviously, when it came to pass, they could look back and say, "Oh, that's what that meant."
Yep.
But then at the time, it didn't know.
Right. So it was given to him to record. In fact, Jesus will see him say that to him. Write down the things that you see and that you hear. And so John, no doubt, is not understanding this as he's recording it himself. He's just recording the visions. One other thing, I can't remember if I said this, but you probably already know, the Christians were beginning to undergo severe persecution at this time. And so the things that are being told are going to relate to their persecutors. So if somebody's house gets ransacked and they find these scrolls, these writings there, and it's calling out their persecutors by name, then it could bring even greater persecution upon them. And so this code, if you will, this symbols, would also hide what it's saying about the persecutors from the persecutors. They would not begin to understand this. So that may be another benefit as well, but that's not stated. All right, so how do we break this code? How do we decrypt this? So the language that we see here actually exists in a lot of the Old Testament books. So Daniel uses this, Zechariah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, parts of Joel. There's several of the Old Testament books who actually use this exact same language, and we know what they mean because we have New Testament commentary on these verses. Peter and others will say, this is what was fulfilled. This fulfills what was spoken by Joel, or whatever the case may be. So, because we understand the Old Testament usage in those places, that gives us kind of a key that we can use to understand Revelation as well. So that's kind of our decoder ring, if you will, that we're going to take into this book. And we're going to use that to understand all these symbols. So another interesting thing is that by some counts, there's somewhere between 260 to 400 allusions to these Old Testament symbols that we've been talking about. None of them are direct quotes. You're not going to find any of the Old Testament symbols just copied verbatim and reused. So again, how did you learn your first language? You learned it by just association, just being immersed in it. And eventually you started associating words with things. And you started making that map. You're going to have to do the same thing with Revelation. We're going to see the associations in the Old Testament, but we're not going to see whole sentences lifted out of the Old Testament and reused in the New Testament. They're all adapted for the book of Revelation. So you're going to kind of have to learn the vocabulary from the Old Testament and use that to break down the sentences and the paragraphs of these visions, if you will, in the book of Revelation. So kind of open your mind to that and be prepared to do that. The one that I think comes the closest is Daniel 7. And I think that provides the best preview. In fact, I think Revelation is basically a continuation, an elaboration of where Daniel leaves off in Daniel 7. So it comes closest to that. And I think that will give us the best understanding of Revelation by looking at it from that standpoint. All right. So let's talk about the date of writing. Usually this doesn't make that much of a difference. In the book of Revelation, it makes a big difference because it changes the primary point of application in really kind of the way that we understand the whole book. Now, if people end up disagreeing about this, it's not going to change the overall theme or message, but it will make it a little bit harder to understand, and it will end up being like a source of disagreement and kind of confusion. But you can still get the main themes, the main ideas out of the book, even if you don't understand exactly who it's applying to. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the date of writing. So what are the two most common date ranges that are advocated for writing Revelation? So somebody give me those. What's the first one, the early date?
54 AD to 69 AD.
All right, very good. So 54 to 68, 69, somewhere in that era. The key is it's up until AD 70, not after AD 70. Give me the late date.
95 to 97.
95 to 97. All right, very good. So the primary difference between those two is the early date thinks that the book applies to the destruction of Jerusalem and Jewish persecution. Maybe some help from Nero and there's some Roman persecution, but it's primarily intended talking about the Jewish nation. Like Jerusalem is the ultimate bad guy in that view of the book. In the late date, Roman persecution, Rome would be kind of the ultimate bad guy in that, or something else, depending on how you look at the book. But it's for sure not Jews in Jerusalem. All right, so the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 kind of makes the dividing line. Now, the early date is, in both cases, there's some internal and there's some external evidence that goes with both of those. So let me just provide those for you real quick. So the early date support, I think, I'll be honest, I think a lot of this support is tenuous at best. All right, so here's one of the internal clues. If you take Emperor Nero's name in Rome, but you put it into Greek, and then you translate that into Hebrew, and then you take the numerical value of each of those letters, alpha being 1, beta being 2, etc. And if you sum up all the letters of Neron Caesar, you get 666. So it must be Emperor Nero, all right? But you had to go from Roman language to Greek, so from Latin to Greek to Hebrew, and then you had to sum them up. I mean, why? Who would know to do that? All right. So, but that's one of the things that they're going to point to. A lot of these people will also, when we get to the beast and talk about his horns, they're going to start counting out the literal kings, and it turns out Nero is actually the 6th emperor of Rome, and the sixth horn is pretty bad in Rome. So there's another clue that could be talking about Nero. Now, there are references to Jews and problems that they're creating in Jewish potential persecution for Christians. So in chapters 2 and 3, we're going to see some Jews who are blaspheming and creating problems for Christians there. And then in 11:8, the great city, the harlot, is identified as the city where our Lord was crucified. Well, that's going to be in Jerusalem, right? So that's going to be one of the big clues. Now, I'm not going to answer that one because that's one of your questions when we get to chapter 11. But that's one of the things that they point to. All right. Other thing is, well, it does mention the temple, so I guess the temple was still around. That's just an assumption. And it doesn't have to be that way, but this is one of the assumptions that they're making. Now, one thing that I think is in its favor, if you go through the Old Testament, look at the prophets, Jerusalem, I mean, both in the history as well as the prophets, is continually killing the prophets. They are persecuting God's true people, and there's a lot of prophecies about the destruction of Jerusalem and their rejection of Jesus. So it would be very convenient if Revelation is just a continuation of that. And it's a very easy leap to make that. However, I will say there are also prophecies about Roman persecution as well. Not as many, but there are prophecies. Again, Daniel 2, Daniel 7, there are prophecies about the Roman government and the fact that they would make war with God's saints. So you can't say that it has to go as an application to Jerusalem. All right, so the late date, I think this fits a whole lot better. We'll talk about this more. Again, there's both internal and external. I think one of the most powerful points is actually all of the people around this, the church fathers, they all said that this was written about this time. So the historical support from the people that we trust to say, yes, these are the inspired books, to kind of corroborate the inspiration and the claims of Scripture, these same people also give us this date for Revelation as well. So I think that's pretty compelling. The other thing is as we go through the book, we're going to see there's a religious-based persecution. And this is going to be something we're going to see is widespread. So the persecution of Jews against Christians would have been more focused in Jerusalem. It wouldn't have been a global thing. So I think this fits better with Rome doing this as well. Also, when Nero persecuted Christians, it was just in Rome. It didn't get outside the city. Again, we're going to be talking about something that's global in scope, so that doesn't fit as well. Also, the harlot herself is described as being someone who influences many nations and sits over them and rules over them. I don't see how you could take Jerusalem to fit that. Even if you say, well, it's a religious influence, it's still too big of a scope. The other thing that's kind of interesting is we're going to see Ephesus has some problems. If we take the early date, then that means within just a couple of years of Paul writing the book of Ephesians and commending them, this church has gone over the deep end and has lost its first love. That seems pretty unlikely that would happen in just a year or two. So that's kind of hard to accept. And then just as a counter, the whole point about the temple, it's not a good point. After the destruction of Jerusalem, the first time when the Jews were taken into captivity, Ezekiel has a vision and he sees the temple in it. And we know the temple had already been destroyed. So there's precedent for the temple appearing in visions after it's been destroyed. So that's not, their concern about that is not a good concern at all. All right. Any questions about early date or late date support? All right, very good. So let's talk a little bit about the occasion of writing. I just want you to kind of get an idea of what's the climate, the timeline, just a refresher. I know you all know this, but you think about Jesus being born in somewhere between like 4 to 6 BC. We have the calendar wrong. He was actually born probably a few years before when BC AD starts. That's just improvements, better understanding of history from when the calendar was first made. So if Jesus was about 30 when he begins his ministry, crucified about 33, that's going to put it about AD 28 to 31 when Jesus is here and the church is established. Very shortly after that, think about the book of Acts, we have Jewish persecution, and then it starts in Jerusalem, then Samaria, remember the commission, and then to all the parts of the earth in Acts 1 when Jesus was sending out the apostles. We have a record in Colossians 1, 5 to 6 that the gospel had gone into all the world. In Acts 17, 6, we have the people there complaining about the Christians who had come, I can't remember what city that was, but it was either in Macedonia, I think it was in Macedonia, but they were saying the people that have turned the world upside down have come here. So Christianity is spreading out very quickly, being very pervasive. And this continues till about AD 64, 68, and this is the first time that I mentioned earlier we see persecution from Rome. Nero brings persecution right in Rome. The history suggests that he didn't like the way parts of old Rome looked, so he burned them down, but then the people got mad about that because he wanted to rebuild it and make it look pretty. And people got mad at that, and he used Christians as a scapegoat, which wasn't hard because they weren't super liked anyway. There was some level of distrust, and so they made a convenient scapegoat. And his persecution was severe, but it didn't last that long, and it ended with him. And there was some period of peace. Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, and that ended the Jewish persecution. And then eventually Domitian comes along and Roman persecution begins again, and the book of Revelation is written about that time period. This is our late date. So we have this severe persecution that is going at this point. All right. Very quickly, there are several emperors of Rome that persecuted Christians. Nero was the first. I have the dates for you here. Domitian was bad. There were several others that were also bad. The later ones were actually the worst as far as we know. So Decius, Valerian, and Diocletian. Diocletian was supposedly the worst of all, at least according to the records we have. It was a long time ago, so it's hard to say for sure about those kinds of things relative to each other. All right, but not all of the Roman emperors that way. There was several that had other issues, but they weren't persecuting the Christians on top of that. So, one thing to keep in mind about Rome at this point in time, it's extremely wealthy. But the way it got so wealthy is by conquering other nations and just basically bringing their economy and resources into its own. It didn't get rich through creation and building. It got rich through conquest. And so a huge amount of its population was slaves. Later, there would be a lot of German immigrants that would come in as well, and that would also offset a lot of the population. So a lot of Rome was not Rome. And you should be thinking about the vision of Daniel. Remember what was in the toes of the feet? Partly iron, partly clay, and they didn't mix. So you can see how this worked out in practicality because of the population, because of the wealth versus the slaves, and then later the German immigrants. These people did not bind together, and they didn't have the same agenda. Other thing is it was a decadent civilization. I mean, lust knew no bounds. I'm not going to give you examples and details, but I mean, just the depravity is unlike anything that we even talk about, much less know. It was very bad, and then also their children were not only abused very early, they were also neglected as well. So this is a civilization that's breaking down at all levels. So you got social, like class issues, but then they also have moral issues, and then from generation to generation, there's a gap and a loss of generations just basically failing because they're not being taken care of and not being brought up. So Rome is undergoing profound decay during this time period as well, which is contributing to a lot of its issues, and understanding this will make a lot of the comments make a lot more sense. Like I said, the iron and the clay from Daniel 2. You're going to see other things that make a lot more sense as we go through the book of Revelation, so you'll find this information helpful as we go. All right, now let's talk about the interpretation of the book. So one of the things that's going to jump out is, you've probably already heard of the 1,000-year reign that shows up in chapter 20. And oftentimes called the millennium. How you look at this has a big impact on the book as a whole. So it's good to get some of the terminology in front of you. So what's the three most common views for interpreting the millennium?
One, that it's already happened.
Mm-hmm.
2, that it's going to happen. And 3, that it's figurative.
All right, very good. Now, I don't like big words for showing off, but people use the words, so it's good to know what they mean so you don't get thrown off when you heard them. What's the word for it hasn't happened yet and it's going to happen? Premillennialism. All right, the one that says that it's behind us is postmillennial, and then the one that says it's not even literal, it's not really going to happen, amillennial. So A being the not, or the negating the word. All right, so all of these are named according to when and then whether or not it's literal. So premillennial says Jesus returns before the 1,000 year. And again, the pre and the post is relative to when Jesus appears, his second coming. So it's either before the millennial, that's premillennialism. Postmillennialism says that he's going to return afterwards. Premillennial is probably the one that we'll run into in the most, like Christianity as a whole. You're going to find that is probably the most common belief. A lot of the media and a lot of the comments, especially about the rapture and things like that, that's all premillennial references. Postmillennial believes that that the world is just going to keep getting better and better and better, and basically Christianity is going to take over the world at even a social level. So like, we're going to stomp out like world hunger and slavery, and all of the social issues will all be wiped out. And basically, once we turn earth into heaven, then we will roll right into, Jesus will appear at that point and we'll go into the real heaven. That's really the view of postmillennialism. And if you see a lot of emphasis, people saying heaven begins now, and kind of slogans like that, a lot of these people are postmillennial. And these people that are focusing on social issues, it's because they think this is how Christianity progresses. This is how it marches forward, is at a social level by kind of taking over the world. And so a lot of these people are not going to call themselves postmillennialists, and they may not even realize, like I said, it's a big word, but this is often the case. And then the amillennialists say that it's a symbolic reign. There is a millennium, but it is not a literal 1,000 years. It's a long, undetermined period of time, but it's figurative. We don't know exactly, and Jesus is going to return after it. So these graphs provide a very simple kind of illustration of these three timelines. Premillennialism has a ton of different like minor varieties. There's like they have it the post-tribulational and the pre-tribulational, also called the dispensational. We're not going to get into all of that. But anyway, they have a lot of different nuances, and they have a lot of different internal disagreements about the exact timeline. But the gist of the timeline is the same in all of these. That Jesus is going to come back before 1,000 years and then set up his kingdom on earth, a literal kingdom. It'll be a literal 1,000 years. All right, any questions about either of these three views of the millennium? All right, so that's the millennium. Like I said, that's kind of one of the major, most standout features of Revelation that a lot of people end up talking about. But that's not the whole book. So let's take a step back. Let's talk about the whole book. What are the most common views for interpreting the book of Revelation?
Futurists, preturists, the continuous historical, idealist, and historical background.
All right, good. So somebody tell me about the futurists. How does the futurist look at the book?
Most of the prophecies will be fulfilled in the future.
Fulfilled in the future, and are they going to take this symbolically or literally? Literally. They're actually looking for a literal interpretation, a literal fulfillment of these prophecies. All right, for the sake of time, I'm going to speed up a little bit. So the futurists, they're going to be your premillennialists. The preterists having to do with the past. This one's a little complex, but the gist of it is that Revelation was fulfilled in the past. There's actually a preterist view of all end times, where they believe even the resurrection has passed. Bruce Reeves had a debate a year or two ago with one of them. If you get a chance to listen to it, I haven't listened to it, but I know he would have done a good job. Full preterists, like I said, some of these people may even doubt the inspiration of scriptures. Would be very literal, but others are going to think that it really has passed. Oftentimes we think about these as being the AD 70 or the Max King people. Max King was a very influential leader in that group. Partial preterist is going to kind of be what it sounds like. They're going to believe most everything was fulfilled in the past, but not all of it. The continuous historical, this is going to be your Alexander Campbells. This is going to be people that from the Restoration movement, they saw themselves and projected themselves into the book of Revelation. And they think that Revelation was a record of like all history. Like it contains like references to Muhammad and Islam's rise and into the Dark Ages and the Catholic Church. And in that view, the last bad guy is the Catholic Church. And so that was the big threat during the days of Alexander Campbell and the Restoration Movement. And so because they projected themselves in it, that's what they saw. They were also post-millennial. Like Alexander Campbell's paper was called The Millennial Harbinger. And he really thought, and most of the leaders at that time thought, that they were having such great success is because Jesus was going to be coming back soon. They really thought that they were paving the way and in leading up to that. So, fell out of favor because obviously a lot of those things didn't work out as they planned. But it is something that you'll run into in a lot of the commentaries. The idealist is the one, by the way, the preterist is going to look for very specific fulfillments. Like each horn, each head, each mountain is going to refer to a specific king, a specific city. It's going to be very detailed. The idealist kind of takes a step back and says these are general truths about general things, general principles, and so it never like specifically applies. It's not a reference to any specific king or nation or anything. This is just kind of the way the world works. This is the way the forces that are behind the world works. And so you can kind of apply it all the time, but it's not really a specific description of anything. So very, very step back, very kind of abstract way of looking at the book of Revelation. And then the exception would be potentially is the last few chapters where it refers to heaven and whatnot. So the first four that we've talked about outside the Church of Christ, they're going to tell you about four. And it's going to be those first four we talked about. Within churches of Christ, a lot of the commentaries that they write, they will take a fifth position called the historical background. And what they're going to do is they're going to blend some aspects of each of these. So they're going to believe that it's primarily fulfilled in the past, kind of like the preterists. And I think that's right. I think it's references to Rome and the Roman persecution. So that part of the preterist view fits. However, I'm not going to be like the ideal, or I'm not going to be like the preterists and tie everything to a specific king, a specific city. I don't think it's that specific. There's too many use of symbolic numbers. And so those are going to represent things. And so that's going to be a little bit more like the idealist, but I do believe there's a specific application, like I said, Rome, and of imminent threat to them that was mostly fulfilled in the past. Again, last three chapters being an exception. But you know what? This is how we interpret all the books in the New Testament. Think about 1 Corinthians. Do we have trouble with eating of meats or observing of days or the persecution in chapter 7? Most of the specific problems that we read about in the New Testament do not directly apply to us. We extract the principles out of those and apply them to us. That's all this view is doing to the book of Revelation. Original application to the people, Roman persecution, pulling the principles out and then applying it to us. All right, we're going to talk about themes next time. And we'll wrap up this introduction and then we'll get into our actual text. So make sure you come prepared to go through lesson 2, which is chapter 1. Thank you all. Appreciate the participation and look forward to meeting with you next time.